Good day, and thank you so much for tuning in on today, and welcome to this brief but in-depth segment of biblical studies as we walk through and journey through this Pauline epistle of Galatians. If you never have read Galatians before, it is a tremendous blessing and covers a lot of spiritual truths, a lot of theological doctrine, if you will. So hopefully the last segment was a blessing for you, but let's get started. We are in the first chapter of Galatians, and we're going to commence reading at verse 11, and we will try to cover the duration of this chapter during this segment. Which is from, again, verse 11 through verse 24. All right, so let me begin reading these verses first, and I'm going to read from the King James translation, and we'll go from there. All right, so Galatians chapter 1, verse 11, again from the King James translation, it says, "But I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after man. For I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but by the revelation of Jesus Christ. For ye have heard of my conversation in time past in the Jews' religion, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted it, and profited in the Jews' religion above many my equals in mine own nation, being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of my father or fathers. But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood, neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again unto Damascus. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter, and abode with him 15 days. But other of the apostles saw I none, save James the Lord's brother. Now the things which I write unto you, behold, before God I lie not. Afterwards I came into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and was unknown by face unto the churches of Judea which were in Christ, but they had heard only that he which persecuted us in times past now preached the faith which once he destroyed. And they glorified God in me." All right, and that concludes the first chapter. Again, I pray that the previous segment was a blessing to you. We covered the first 10 verses of the first chapter, and how, I won't get all into that, but how Paul basically defended his apostleship. First of all, he defended that he was an apostle. There were Jewish Christians, Judaizers, who many scholars believe were, again, Jewish Christians who had infiltrated the church there at Galatia and attacked Paul's apostleship, that Paul was not really an apostle. So Paul starts off this letter by defending his apostleship, but then secondly, by defending the very gospel that he preaches. He defends that he is an apostle, but then secondly, he defends the gospel. And then we covered that Paul mentions that if anyone else, even an angel, preach any other gospel, let him be accursed. All right, so we went over that in the previous section. Now here, he continues to defend his apostleship, but he does it very interestingly. Number one, Paul defends his apostleship by defending the gospel. He defends his apostleship by defending the gospel that he preaches. And Paul, as it begins, Paul in verse 11, he states that how he received the gospel. So, in other words, these verses that we're covering today, Paul gets very personal. He is conveying a personal testimony of how he was called to be an apostle, or some of the events that happened afterwards. But he testifies more so how he received the gospel. Paul states that he did not receive it from men. As a matter of fact, he states that he was not even taught this gospel. He received it directly from Jesus Christ himself. It was by revelation. Paul states it was by revelation that he received the gospel. Again, in verse 11, he says, King James Version, I certify you, brethren, that the gospel which was preached of me is not after men. It was not after a man. It was not, I was not taught this. This gospel that I preached came by direct revelation of Jesus Christ himself. And so that's like a basic theme of his argument. Okay, the basis or the theme of Paul's whole argument here is that the gospel was revealed to him by Jesus Christ himself. It was revealed to him. Now, let me say this parenthetically, because some of you are ministers and pastors, but even if you're not, a New Testament epistle or a New Testament book that can and should be read and studied concurrently or alongside of the book of Galatians is actually the book of Acts. Now, I say this because in this instance, as Paul defends his apostleship as well as the gospel and how he received it, was by revelation and so forth, well, we can actually see that in the book of Acts. Acts chapter 9 to be exact. Luke records Paul's calling. And I won't go into detail in that, but you'll find that in chapter 9 of how Saul is on the road to Damascus and he is called by Christ. And so that's recorded in chapter 9 of Acts. And then also Paul even lays this out again in Acts chapter 26. Luke records this as Paul gives his defense in chapter 26 of Acts. So there again, the book of Acts is actually a great book to read and study alongside of not only Galatians, but many of Paul's epistles, because Luke records Paul's life, his doctrine, his theology. Luke records that in the book of Acts. So here again, that's the basis, that's the theme. Here is his defense and how he defends it, that he receives the gospel by direct revelation. Then Paul, again, he gives his a personal testimony. He gives his previous conduct beginning in verse 13. He gives it's a personal testimony and how his previous conduct, his previous manner of living, his way, how he used to be, how he used to live before Christ called him, before he became an apostle. And so we see that Paul is a conservative Jew. Not only was Paul a conservative Jew, not only did he study and practice ancient Judaism, but to be more precise, Paul was actually a Pharisee of the law. Okay? He was actually a Pharisee. And you can actually see this also in another one of Paul's epistles to Philippians. The epistle to Philippians, Philippians chapter 3. And you'll see that Paul was actually a Pharisee. Look at verse 13 again, if you will. For you have heard of my conversation in time past in the Jews' religion, that is Judaism. Okay, how that beyond measure I persecuted the church of God and wasted it. So he's laying this out here, how he used to be. Paul, he did not only persecute the church, he did it with such a zeal, such a passion. Pharisees were known for their rigid and their strict adherence to the law. Paul he wore it as a badge, how well he kept the law. It was God's law. It was the law through Moses, of course, that was given to Israel. And so Paul kept that law, and so he was not only a conservative Jew, but again, he was actually a Pharisee of the law, and was known for how he observed it, how he adhered and observed the law. But not only that, even his name, Paul's name in the Hebrew is Saul. Okay, in the Hebrew language, it is Shaul. Many scholars believe that Paul, or his Jewish name, Saul, that he had received that name, or he was named rather, after Israel's first king. Because if you're familiar with the story or with the Hebrew Bible, which is what we as Christians refer to as the Old Testament, you know that Israel's first king was King Saul. So many scholars believe that Saul here, his Jewish name that is, he was named after Israel's first king. So Paul is just kind of laying this out, and how he used to be and how he persecuted the church. Okay, that word persecute comes from a Greek word that is dioko. It actually means persecute or to pursue. Okay, so he persecuted the church, and pursued them. And again, here I want to just underscore the fact that not only he just persecuted the church, but it's how he did it. He did it in such a way, with such passion, with such a zeal. He persecuted them. He pursued them. Let's read it in a different translation. I want to read this from the NIV. Listen to what it says. For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. Okay, the Amplified Version also, it says it like this. It paraphrases it. You have heard of my career and former manner of life in Judaism, how I used to hunt down and persecute the church of God extensively, and with fanatical zeal tried my best to destroy it. So again, I wanted to just kind of underscore that Paul not only persecuted and pursued the church of God, Christians, but he did it in a way with such a passion, with such a zeal. Well, you may ask, well, Roach, why did he do this? Well, we're going to get into that as we move on in this epistle, but just to kind of throw you just a little bit here, a side note. Part of the reason why Paul did this in his former life was he actually believed that he was doing the will of God. See, you have to understand that Jesus was hung on a cross, and in the law of Moses, and for those of you that did not know, that the law of Moses, or the 5 books of Moses, are really the first 5 books of our Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So according to the law, particularly the book of Deuteronomy, it states that cursed is every man who hangs from a tree. And again, we'll get into this later on in the epistle. But Jesus was hung on a tree. So in Paul's eyes, Jesus was cursed by God. And so in Paul's eyes, he is doing the will of God, that Jesus got what he deserved. And so I am those who dare to follow this man. I'm going to persecute them. I'm going to pursue them because I keep the law of God. Okay? And so this is partly why, Saul, if you will, before he was changed and called by God to be an apostle, this is why he did it. And he thought he was doing the will of God. And so he was, again, he kept the law, his strict adherence to the law, a Pharisee of the law. And this is why he persecuted the church of God, and why he did it in the way he did it, with such a passion, with such zeal. Now, moving from his previous conduct and moving to his prevailing conversion, because I love verse 15. Verse 15 says, once again, but when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace. It's amazing to me, because in spite of what Paul is saying here, he's conveying to these Galatian Christians that in spite of my past, what I'm doing now, what I am preaching and teaching now, this gospel, I was set aside to do this. I was destined to do this. This is my purpose. I was called by God to do what I'm doing right now. This is just a blessing for me. When it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's belly. That word separate, again, in the original language of the New Testament, which is Greek, it is aphorisas or aphorisas. It denotes to appoint, to set apart one for some purpose, to do something. Let me say that again. So this Greek word simply denotes to appoint, or to set apart for a particular purpose. That is from Thayer's Greek lexicon. So in other words, what Paul is saying here is that I was set apart. I was sanctified. I was set apart from my mother's womb. When it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb, who sanctified, set me apart from my mother's womb. Okay, why did he do it? Why did God do that? To reveal his son in me. That is what Paul says, verse 16, to reveal his son in me. That word reveal in the original language of the New Testament is apocalypsis. It is that word revelation. Okay, like the book of Revelation, apocalypse or apocalypsis. It means to reveal or to unveil. Okay, so in other words, Paul is saying, when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, to reveal his son in me, to unveil his son in me, that I may preach him among the heathen. Okay, so God again separated or set apart Paul, actually, in spite of his previous conduct, he was set apart from his mother's womb. That was the will of God, in order that Christ be revealed or unveiled in him, so that he would preach to the Gentiles. Okay, that's verse 16. To reveal his son in me, that I may preach or proclaim him to the Gentiles. Greek word ethnos, ethnic, is where we get that English word. That I may preach him to the nations. That I would preach Jesus, God's son, to the Gentiles, to the nations. And let me just add this in here as we go through this very briefly, but I think it is a blessing to understand this, even where you are now. And again, I know that some of you are ministers who listen to this, and I do appreciate your time. But those of you who are ministers and pastors, but even if you are not, whether you're preaching, teaching, whether you sing, whatever it is, you were set apart. You were separated to do what you do. You were called to do what you do, even from birth, in spite of how you used to be. You were destined to do what you do. If I can just be a little personal, just even as I proclaim God's word, whether it's in a pulpit, whether it's via a classroom, or even now using social media, regardless of the platform, I was set apart to do what I'm doing now. You know, many of you don't know, but when I was very, very young, a child, I was so quiet. I was so timid. I was so just very, very quiet and shy. You know, you could get very few words from me. And I know that's probably hard to believe. Matter of fact, I have an uncle who used to call me when I was younger. He used to call me Smiley because he said I never said anything. All I did was just sit and just smile, you know, and he's probably listening to this right now. And but that's how I used to be. And it's amazing, you know, but how come you can do this now? How come you can preach and teach and so forth, whether it's a small group or a large church or whatever have you? How can you do that now? Well, I was set apart to do this. I was called to do this. It's a grace. I cannot do it in and of myself, but God will give you a grace to do what you've been called to do. And so Paul is giving his testimony on this. And moving on to verse 17, verse 16 again, to reveal his son in me, that I may preach him among the heathen. That's what the King James translates it. But to preach him among the Gentiles, the ethnos, to preach him among the nations. Okay. Immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood. In other words, Paul said, when I first did this, or first received this, I did not consult with anybody. I did not consult with anybody. And then verse 17, I did not go to Jerusalem to consult with the apostles, with the initial 12 apostles. Paul is saying that I didn't even do that at the outset, at the very beginning. He talks about in verse 17, I went to Arabia. Okay, and that Arabia is part of present day Saudi Arabia. Okay, Paul said I went there to Arabia and then returned to Damascus. But after that, in verse 18, he says, then I went to Jerusalem. And I went to Jerusalem and talked with Peter. He went to speak with Peter and actually stayed with Peter 15 days, which is a couple of weeks. But how did he know Peter? Well, you have to understand that Peter was a very well-known figure at that time with the church that was at Jerusalem. Peter was a very prominent figure. Remember, Peter preached on the day of Pentecost. You know, some 3,000 souls were added. Peter preaching, teaching, even Peter's miracles. As a matter of fact, Luke records in the book of Acts that people would even set their sick folks on the side of the roads that they that even just the shadow of Peter, they would be healed by just the shadow of Peter. So again, the book of Acts, Luke records a lot of this. The first 12 chapters or so is mostly geared towards the ministry of Peter. And then around chapter 13 of Acts throughout, Luke records the ministry and the life of Paul. And that's why I said the book of Acts is really a great book to read and study alongside of Galatians and many other of Paul's epistles. So Paul here again, he talks about he did not go up to Jerusalem at first. He did not see any of the initial 12 apostles. He went out to Arabia, then to Damascus. Then he goes to Jerusalem, talks to Peter for a couple of weeks and sees him. And then in verse 19, Paul states that none of the other apostles he's seen except James, the Lord's brother. So he actually consulted and talked with James, the Lord's brother. But how did he know him? Well, you have to understand that James was another huge figure and very prominent in the church at Jerusalem at that time. As a matter of fact, he was like one of the head leaders of the church there at that time. It was James, the Lord's brother. Not James the apostle, the brother of John. You have James and John who were the sons of Zebedee. So not that James, because that James had already died. He was killed by Herod. And you can see that, you can read about that in Acts chapter 12. But it was James, the Lord's brother, that was over the church at Jerusalem and that Paul had consulted with. Okay, and then moving out to verse that's verse 19, and then verse 20 and 21. We already read those. I won't go into that. Paul just basically saying that he is not lying. He is telling the truth to these Galatian Christians. What is interesting, one last thing as we close out, verse 22 and verse 23. And was unknown by face unto the churches of Judea which were in Christ. They did not know him by face, but they had heard about him. Paul saying that those churches heard about me. Look at verse 23 once again. But they had heard only that he which persecuted us in times past now preaches the faith which he once destroyed. And they gave God praise and glory for it. Paul's testimony here actually gave glory to God. That this very faith that Paul tried his best to destroy and tried to persecute and pursue, it is that very faith now that he is advocating and preaching and teaching about. So Paul continues with his testimony on into chapter 2. So the next segment, we're going to continue reading in chapter 2 as Paul gives his testimony to these Galatian Christians. And I say his testimony, but what he is really doing is defending his apostleship by defending the gospel of Christ, that he did not receive it from men. Nor was he taught this gospel, but he received it by direct revelation from Jesus Christ himself. So that is our lesson. And so that concludes chapter 1 as we go right into chapter 2, the next segment. Keep in mind now that these epistles, the way our Bible was originally written, this is a letter. So originally when Paul wrote this, there were no chapters. There were no verses. This is just one letter to the Galatian Christians. And but thank God for chapters and verses that give us the appropriate divisions. And so we're going to go right into chapter 2 on the next segment. I pray that this was a blessing to you. And just keep in mind that you were called and separated by birth to do whatever it is God has called you to do. Blessings to you. Have a blessed week. See you next time.